Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a special regular session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Wednesday, July 31st, 2024. The time is 6:33 p.m. The first agenda item is roll call. Joe Murphy. Here. Susan Axelrod. Here. Robin Pothier. Here. Liz Karp. Here. Caper Wilson. Here. Peter DiStefano is absent, and Maria Mack is here. We have no items on our consent agenda. And our first item is a public hearing, major land development, change to a previously approved conceptual master plan, 571 Main Street. This item was continued from the our July 23rd regular meeting to this meeting for the sole purpose of continuing the application to an alternative date. No testimony or public comment on the application itself will be taken during this discussion.
So, Madam Chair, thank you for that introduction. So with regards to 571 Main Street, given staff constraints, meeting space constraints, as well as planning board availability, there are primarily two options for you. And that would be to have this as a regular agenda item at your regularly scheduled meeting on the 27th, which I believe legal counsel for the applicant is available. And the other option would be to add this to your work session as an agenda item and then have any work session items follow that agenda item. And that would be on the 15th.
Jamie, I thought that some of our conversation related to the fact that this is a something that deserves time and effort, and we were going to schedule a special meeting just for this item. I believe legal counsel for the applicant had suggested that as well.
The availability of the town council, there was one additional meeting date in August without looking at September.
How flexible are you folks, and what's your availability? You should see a red light just by the mic.
Okay, I think we're good. Madam Chair, for the record, Attorney Matthew Leander on behalf of the applicant. It was my understanding that a special meeting would be scheduled because of the level of interest and the history with the property, so I think that is a good idea. Speaking with Mr. Rabbit prior to the meeting as to the potential meeting dates, August 15th and the regular meeting on August 27th, my client is unavailable on the 15th and certainly would like him to be able to attend and testify on the record. I am away August 12th to, I think, the 15th of August. The 27th, I could certainly be available, and so could my client, understanding that that's the regular meeting date. If it goes into September, certainly we're flexible, so whatever the board's pleasure to accommodate a special meeting.
Thank you. I think it would be useful to ask board members, and sometimes our with all the greatest intent, our agenda items go from, 3 to 10. And you saw our last meeting had 6 public hearings scheduled.
Yeah.
So it seems as though if we can get the space and have availability, it really would make sense to have a meeting for this item as a special meeting if it's at all possible.
Madam Chair, we did not look at meeting dates in September, but what we potentially could do this evening is you could continue it to your work session on the 15th. At what time, during that time, we would look at dates in September, and we would also coordinate with Mr. Landry's office on their availability as well as planning board member availability. So,
do board members think that's a great idea? Sure. I won't be available the last week of August. Okay. So you would be available in September.
I'm flexible, I can be available anytime.
Excellent, thank you.
And in all likelihood, we would be looking at Wednesday or Thursday evenings.
All right. Would someone like to make a motion then to continue this to the work session on August 15th in order to further discuss a date for September?
Madam Chair, I was also note, similar to what you read before, that the intent of continuing it would be for the sole purpose of picking a alternative date. No testimony or public comment on the application itself will be taken during your August 15th meeting.
I'll make that motion.
We have a motion in paper, do we have? Oh, go ahead.
Just a note, I have some travel planned early September. I was planning on being back for the regular session, but early part of September up to the regular, not regular session, the workshop, I won't be here.
Okay, so, but you would be here for the work session date?
I would be here for work
Okay.
session anytime.
The date, okay.
And anytime in August as well.
Okay, thank you. Any further comments? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries. Thank you. Our next agenda item is a pre-application concept review, minor subdivision, unified development review, Comiskey minor subdivision. And as a reminder to board members and anyone who might be in the audience, pre-application is an informal kind of review. It is not a public hearing, and it's primarily designed for the sharing of information between applicant, planning board, and staff.
Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the board. My name is Christopher Zangari. I'm an attorney, 935 Jefferson Boulevard, Warwick, Rhode Island. I'm here this evening representing Charles and Charlotte Comiskey. It's 248 Succotash Road, and we're here for a minor subdivision pre-application meeting and discussion under the Unified Development Review Standard. And if you've read your packet, and I'm sure you have, you'll notice the property is, while it's on the screen, is characterized rather euphemistically by the planning department as an irregularly shaped lot. It's highly irregular, very unusual, but they purchased it with that configuration, with a house that was already on the lot, and there's 71,000 square feet of land. And what the Comiskeys are attempting to do, with your approval, is split it into two lots. One would be of conforming size, and one would be substandard. The substandard lot that's proposed would be where the existing house already stands, and what they would be seeking to do is to sell that property to their daughter, who is 42. She's married with one child. She would like to relocate to South Kingstown, but due to the circumstances of the times, she's unable to afford that at a market rate, and what they'd be proposing to do is sell that to her at somewhat of a family discount, and that would still enable them to receive enough funds to, in fact, build on the newly created lot, which would be conforming in size and in all other manners, has plenty of frontage on Silva, has access to town water. They would have to put in an OWTS system, which they're prepared to do, and it would allow them the funds to do that. So before you is something that is not all that complicated to understand, but we do need your approval to get where we're trying to go with this configuration. If you look in your packet, and you'll see some of the surrounding properties are in fact of similar size and dimension to what would be proposed as Lot 1, the substandard lot, and I think almost all of the properties along Silva are of similar size. So they don't meet their substandard as to dimension and have been for quite some time. So we're here, obviously, for your comment and input. You have a little bit of background on where the Comiskeys are trying to get. Hopefully we can get there and achieve their goals. Just as one more, an aside, but I think it's important, is you may be thinking, because I would, well, why don't they just do something else? Why not build an ADU, have daughter live in one and they can live in the other? The problem with that is they can't sell that to her. They can't sell a portion to her and then receive the financial backing. Her daughter would not be able to finance that through an institutional lender, which they need that money to then build the new structure. So that's the reason for that, in case you were wondering. I just wanted to give you that background. But certainly we're here to entertain any thoughts or talk about any comments that you may have. And Mr. Tights looks like he's got a comment.
I thought that perhaps we could hear from legal counsel relative to the Unified Development Review process and anything else you think is relevant.
Right. So this is a little unusual for me as well. I really haven't been involved with a pre-application meeting with the board on Unified Development Review. All of the pre-application applications that I've been involved for Unified Development have been with staff in different communities. And if you think about it, the example was if someone were just going to the zoning board for the variance, they wouldn't, again, they could have a pre-app meeting with the zoning officer and staff, but they wouldn't have a meeting with the board because in that board function, you're a quasi-judicial board and you don't want to be, making findings ahead of time before anything is presented to you. On the other hand, the goal of a pre-application meeting is to give feedback to the applicant. So we're kind of walking a tightrope there. I think you need to focus your comments on the planning aspects of it, the issues as to lot size, SAMP area, things like that deal with it, and not get into any questions about hardship or anything like that that would be findings so much with the zoning board. I mean, there's going to be some overlap no matter what, but I just caution you that, that you can give your opinions, but realize that it's all subject to them coming in and presenting evidence to you and needing to make their case.
So Madam Chair, just if I can take a moment just to break the legal jargon down to layperson terms. All right. Liz looked like she would appreciate that. So to Andy's point, you're in a unique scenario because the legislation changed this past year. So in a normal scenario, the applicant would have been required to go to the zoning board to seek a variance to create a lot that didn't meet the dimensional requirements contained with the town's zoning regulations. But under Unified Development Review and DPR review, that judicial function, which normally lies with a zoning board of appeals or a zoning board, was granted to the planning board. But you still have to evaluate that in a quasi-judicial manner as it relates to hardship and your ability to allow someone to vary from the regulations. So in a normal pre-legislative change, they'd be with a completely different board evaluating relief from the zoning regulations. Once potentially that relief was granted, they could apply to the zoning board, to the planning board, because they had permission to create a lot that didn't comply with the zoning codes. And there's a number of aspects you have to weigh against granting that, which council has advised you not to get into tonight as it relates to hardships and reasoning of why they want to create a substandard lot. And not so much because council has already stated why they want to, but your reaction to that. I don't want you to be prejudiced this evening on your judicial function on granting relief from the regulations. And council can weigh in further on that if you have additional questions. So I think if you have questions about frontage, if you have questions about lot size, if you have questions about lot layout, if you have questions about curb cuts and we'll say the functionality of the lots, that's probably perfectly appropriate. But with regards to any discussion about granting relief, I would caution you on that.
So question for Andy, does that mean that asking the applicant if they were aware of the zoning district in which this parcel was located when it was purchased?
Yes. Yes, that would be a question not to ask. Okay?
Not asked. Thank you. Any other questions related to process or legal issues for Andy or Jamie?
Could you help me understand how the term unified is being used?
Sure. It's a term. Unified Development Review means that the General Assembly has unified, said if someone needs relief from both the Planning Board, from the Development Review Act for some sort of subdivision, and they need relief from the Zoning Enabling Act, they can apply to, and the Planning Board can grant both forms of relief. The idea is one-stop shopping. So you, instead of making those actually 3 trips, because they would have had to go to the Planning Board, Zoning Board, back to Planning Board under the old law, now they just come to you. And when you, when you actually get to it, it's a 2-phase thing. You'll first consider the zoning aspect of it, and then turn to the planning aspect. So if you, for example, if you turn to the zoning aspect and you deny that, then you don't have to get to the subdivision issue. But that's what the law says.
Any other questions for legal? Susan?
So is our decision then the decision, or is the zoning board entirely cut out now of the process?
Yes, the zoning board is out of the process. Your decision is the zoning decision. We'll need to apply those standards, have findings of fact, and if appealed, would be appealed just as any other zoning decision, which actually that's, in fact, as you may remember, the law changed so that planning board decisions now no longer go to the zoning board, but go direct to Superior Court. So that makes sense. Whichever decision you make on this, if it's appealed, would go to Superior Court.
I have 2 questions,
go ahead.
if I may. My first question is really, so is it appropriate at this time to ask for more detail into how the the proposed non-conforming lot, how that would differ from the current zoning requirement?
Yes, I think that's exactly the sort of thing, the things that you would like to see when they come before you on their application. So if you want information about that, if you want, for example, information about the neighborhood around them, and you'd like to be seeing, what are the sizes of the lots around the neighborhood around them. That's the sort of thing, not that they're going to tell you tonight,
Right.
but that you can ask for them so they can prepare that and bring that in when they come before you. That's just the sort of thing to ask.
And is it, I guess my second question is, what is the decision, if any, that we're being asked to make tonight?
None.
None.
No decision tonight.
So this is
Just,
simply
right, that,
informational.
it's informational, it's for you to get information, they've given you this basic information, and for you to give them information such as other things that you're going to be looking for when they come before you, and that what you think would be helpful to you when that decision is being made.
Okay, so I would be interested in having a better understanding of how the existing lot deviates. I would, council mentioned tonight that as we can see from the map that it appears to be in close conformity to the neighboring lots, but to me this is a somewhat small illustration, so I'd be interested in that on a broader scale. And So this is the kind of thing where there would be a public hearing, and we would have an opportunity to hear from members of the public?
Yes, absolutely. They're going to get notice, and it would be a public hearing, and just like everything else, like every other public hearing, yep.
And I would be interested in,
And then you can ask any questions you want.
so just, but it's okay for me to explain what I would be interested in hearing?
Yes, that was, I think, a good thing to suggest tonight.
So I would be interested in hearing about the neighbor's response to the proposal.
You'd be interested in the neighbor's response? I understood you first as I understood your question was, how does the existing lot with the house, as proposed being a substandard lot, compare to other lots in the area regarding lot size? Was that, or did I?
That's the second part of the first question. I apologize for having multiple questions. I can't escape my prior legal training. But I was also, the first part of that question was I would be interested in how the proposed lot with the existing house, how the proposal would deviate from the current zoning, and if there have been zoning changes since the date of purchase, also the original zoning.
And to add to that, have there been other, and perhaps we should pass this map around that shows a larger portion of what the zoning actually is in relation to where this lot is.
And that's the other thing I might as well tell you, that before we would come to that discussion, I would also be taking a closer look at the zoning requirements, so I would be more familiar with the answers, or my understanding of what the answers to those questions would be.
Yes, there's a very good description of what R40 is intended to be, and that would be something that should come from the applicant. I also would like some information from the applicant with regard to the fact that this is in the Salt Pond region, the SAMP, and this is considered a sensitive area with regard to the environment. It is also under the jurisdiction of a CRMC, and there are areas within this map I will also pass around that demonstrate lands that are either lands of critical concern or developed beyond carrying capacity. So I think those are areas that we would like to hear from you with regard to how your request fits in to those designations. And I'm just going to pass these around so that people can see them. We'll go back the other way.
Sorry, Maria, before you pass those around, is that something submitted by the applicant or provided by staff, or?
That was submitted.
Okay, fine, that's all right. I just wanted to make sure you were aware of what they were looking at. No problem.
This was in our packet the night they were originally to appear. The new packet's just in black and white, so it's just easier to see it in color, but it's the same packet
I
we
have no
had 2
problem. I
weeks
just
ago.
wanted to make sure that he was aware, that council was aware of what you were circulating. there.
It's much easier to understand those maps. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, I feel a little handicapped not being able to address those issues, because obviously we're going to address those at some point. But I'd be interested in what the average lot size is within a 200-foot radius of the property boundaries, as well as the median lot size of within 200 feet. Interested in the driveway location. I'd be interested in the vegetation between this lot and the neighboring lot. So at least those two, but I'm not sure what's behind it. So if we could show that, so I understand the
Mr. Murphy, are
vegetation.
you referring to the vegetation
Yep.
in the lot that would be created in the back portion?
Yes.
I can tell you what that is right now. It is low brush.
Okay. So whether there's any, and I can't see it on the drawing, whether there's any fence or any proposed buffer between this and the backyards of the newly created lot and the backyards of those two. Because I just want, at some point, I'm going to want to understand the impacts of those houses being that close, as well as the driveway and potential light shining into their backyard and those types of things.
Well,
We don't need to answer it now. Those
I
are the
know.
types of things I'd be interested in.
absolutely,
when the
I
time comes.
understand. I'm glad you're letting us know of your concerns. But just as a general overview, that proposed second lot, if it were to be created, would be 1 acre. There would be no setback issues. The new structure, by the way, that would be proposed would be modest in size. This was not going to be a McMansion. This is not a 6-bedroom, 3 garage. This is going to be a modest home built for 2 retirees.
And at the time, when the time comes, whether, okay, when the time comes, whether you are proposing that as a condition of approval or just stating it, which means that we have no way of enforcing that later on. So, and again, I'm not
Understood.
requesting either one, but if you can address that when the time comes.
Thank you. That's a very reasonable request.
Madam Chair, if I can just expand upon Mr. Murphy's comment, because I'm sure it will potentially come up, are you intending that to be deed restricted affordable?
No, that is not the intent.
So regardless of what you build there today, could be sold full market rate?
Yes.
Okay. So although they're purporting that it's affordable,
No,
there is
no.
no condition or
He had-
provision to prevent it from
He had
full market?
mentioned that it was going to be a certain size. It was going to be a very modest house.
I said
on this
modest.
additional lot.
Not moderate.
And my question was that going to be a condition of approval, or is it just a statement? If it's a condition of approval, it's a little bit different, holds a little different weight, I think, with people reviewing it.
Liz?
I just have a quick question. Are the Comiskey's planning to live in the second lot?
They are indeed.
They are.
Yes.
Okay.
Just for clarity, as you're evaluating this, it's the creation of a lot. It's not the creation of a lot for an individual. It is the creation of a lot that will be recorded on the land records and for sale to anyone if it is unrestricted. So there's a person A and a person B who are applicants. There's real people associated with person A and person B, but without any deed restriction, they could record that lot. Someone could say, I'm gonna not sell it. Someone offered me $600,000 for it, and it's sold. Done. So again, you have personalities as applicants before you, but it's the proposed creation of an additional building lot.
And with regard to the term modest, which has been mentioned this evening, we do not have the authority to regulate the size of a house that might go on this lot, correct?
No, that's not correct. As in the way
the
of
zoning
granting
part.
relief for creation of an undersized lot, you would have the ability to regulate the size of the house on the undersized lot.
So that's the zoning portion.
Yes.
But my understanding of the presentation was that if we were to grant the request, the undersized lot would be the one with the existing house, and the one with the proposed house would be conforming.
That's correct.
So if that's the case, while we might be able to put a condition on the expansion of the existing house,
Right.
we wouldn't have the ability to limit the...
Well,
I'll do it as a lay planner, and then you can lay in on legal. I think what Andy said is because you're potentially evaluating relief, that you could put restrictions on either lot.
Yeah.
Because it's a condition of granting the relief for the undersized lot.
yeah, I mean, I think you're looking at it as a whole.
No.
And you are definitely increasing the density of the area beyond the allowable zoning. So given that, I do think you could put limitations on the size and the location of the house on the new lot as well. So it seems like one of the things to be asking for would be for them to provide you with a footprint of that house, a maximum footprint of that house and where it's going to be on the lot.
Pardon me, I would be particularly interested in where it's going to be on the lot. That harks back really to the question about screening between, or buffer between the rear lots that are already developed. I mean, there seems to be a significant open backyard, but what I find interesting about the proposal is the proposed house fronts on Silver Road, and so its side yard with, it says 20-foot side back on the map that we're looking at, but that side yard really abuts the existing neighbors' backyards. So, you know, I would be interested in where the buildings are proposed to be located.
Understood.
And the other thing is the overall impact. What is the current square footage of the existing house? What is the OWTS capacity? And then what would the capacity be looking at both of them overall? What would the impact be to the area?
Madam Chair, can I ask the applicant a question?
Of course.
Or a representative of the applicant? Is the side street, which is about the width of a large driveway, is that a public or private street?
Silva, you mean?
Yeah.
That is a private road.
And do you have rights to pass and repass on that private road?
They do.
They do? Okay. Is that deeded?
We're not sure at this point. I don't know. I don't know this evening.
Okay, so there you go, another question to look for.
Can you go back to the terrain map?
I don't believe I had, oh, you mean the...
The previous map that showed
The aerial?
vegetation? Yeah. Can you zoom in a little bit?
As Mr. Parker zoomed out, Madam Chair, I would also expand upon Mr. Murphy's question. If you just ask for lots within 200 feet, you're gonna get basically the lots immediately abutting the neighborhood. It's much larger than the 6 or 7 houses that immediately abut that property.
So the reason I asked for this map, and it hasn't yet gotten larger to zoom in, was to zoom in, yeah. The applicants have stated that it's largely brush, but it does look like there are some tree canopies along the line right there. You can see them now, Silva Street. So that would be something to be aware of, and what impact it would be to an existing buffer that may be comprised of trees and whatever the other understory is. So that's up to you folks to kind of figure out.
So I also have a couple of questions. Even if we were able to restrict or contain the size of the house on the second lot, would both dwellings also, though, be entitled to an accessory dwelling? So might we end up with 4 houses for the price of 2 if this was approved?
That is a question we can clarify for you. Typically in the R40 zone, if it is a compliant lot, it would be able to have an accessory unit. A non-compliant lot has other issues because they would be creating a non-compliant lot. It wouldn't be an existing non-conforming lot. They're creating a non-conforming lot. So we'll do research on that.
That's a really good question. I think we want to be sure we know the answer to that one.
And the other question I have, since this is a new, because this is a new role for us, can we get a a little history of how the zoning board has ruled in similar applications in the past. I'm assuming this isn't the first time somebody's come before the zoning board with a question about creation of a lot, and can we get some idea of?
No. You have to look at each one of these on their own before you. It's up to them to present the evidence to meet the standards, but you've got to look at it on its own.
Not the answer I was expecting.
Well, I mean, the answer to, this is going to cause a precedent and everybody's going to want it, that's the answer there. No, it's not either. If you approve it, it's not going to cause a precedent, or deny it. You look at each one. It's based on the individual lot, neighborhood, hardship, all those factors individually.
And I think that having that conversation with regard to why are lands of critical concern designated as such? Why are they important? And then, of course, other areas develop beyond carrying capacity. Why is that something that's important? Why have those been designated that? What impact may this or may not have upon that?
For some reason, it seems familiar. Did this lot come before us in any way, shape, or form within the last 10 years? This lot or combination of lots?
My client tells me there was an addition, which was a garage on the existing property. And did you come before planning?
Yeah.
He says he was here before planning and zoning. Was it, how long ago?
5 or 6 years.
Within the last 6 years.
It has, or has not?
It has, for the garage, yes.
And it was just a garage for a neighboring property, or for this property?
For the existing structure. Yes.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments?
And I think just about everything has been said. I mean, the standout considerations will be the natural heritage area, the beyond capacity status, and how far away a half-acre lot is from a R40 zoning requirement. Those are the things
It would be, yeah, it's about 15,000 square feet short, because as proposed,
well, you show a 0.5 acre, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Madam Chair, one additional question. I know
Certainly.
Joe's just went on. Was there any relief granted from zoning to build that garage?
Yes, you received a variance. Was it dimensional variance or setback?
I'm assuming because
It was a
proposed there was
setback
no
variance.
other viable spot to build it?
Say that again, Jamie?
Perhaps when they went to zoning, they said there was no other viable spot to build a garage or an addition, yet they owned another acre of land. So one variance has already been granted.
Let me suggest, although the question of other variances around the area, whatnot, is not relevant, it would be for this property. So I think we should try to we'll get from the zoning files a copy of that application to decision, so you can have that before you when this comes in for a hearing. Because it definitely is relevant for the same property.
Just, I guess, a quick question for staff. If it's possible to do a quick look and see what the previous mapping was in this area, whether there was any mapping that maybe went back a little ways and then there was merger, or was this just, what's the history of the subdivision right in the immediate area?
I was potentially going to ask that of the applicant, if they could provide a property history map of the development of the area.
That, as well as some of the other regulations that recently passed, and then understanding the history and how we got here, may be relevant at the time.
So what were you requesting? Mr. Murphy, was that a request for, I'm not sure.
Property history map?
I'm not exactly sure.
I think
haven't
they're
heard
looking
that
for
term.
what the zoning history of the area is.
Of this particular lot?
Yeah, of this lot area. Was this always this zone? Was it fairly recently, was it developed at a lower density and then upzoned? Or vice versa? That's, I think, what they're asking about.
In some cases, and I'm not saying this case at all, but in some cases, especially in these communities near the water, there was some original mapping done back in the 20s and 30s, and then that kind of, there was merger and some changes, but some of the original mapping, and I'm just looking at the other lots, and it almost looks like maybe at one time there was some other mapping and then some zoning changes and merger, but I guess I'm just trying to understand that.
And USDA mapping, you can go back to 1930s. Any other guidance for the applicant? Comments, questions? Jay?
I'd just like to ask has a wetland biologist been out there? Are there any wetlands on the property?
There are no wetlands to our knowledge at all. It's dry. And so the answer is no.
So a biologist hasn't looked at it?
Has
either?
not.
Okay. OWTS permit, septic permit?
We don't have one yet.
Okay.
Want to see how far we get before we do that?
Sure. And the reason I ask is that's required at the preliminary plan stage when you submit for this actual subdivision, when you come in for the relief.
Understood.
That would be required. And I have one other question. This is something more staff related for Andy. I know Brian and I had been speaking about this. I know the UDR regulation requires the decision on the relief to happen prior to the decision on the preliminary plan. However, they are specifically mentioned in the state law that they get submitted at the same time, that the UDR request and the preliminary plan get submitted at the same time. So procedurally, upon conclusion of testimony for an application such as this, could be any other UDR application, would there be two separate motions, a set of findings and a decision on the relief, followed by a set of findings and decision on the preliminary plan?
Yes.
In the same night?
Yes.
Under the same application?
That's
how I understood it too.
assumption, yes.
Just wanted to clarify that, thanks.
Not spread over multiple nights, but two separate motions. As I said, presumably if you deny the zoning relief first, then you don't go on to the second motion.
Right, and the reason why I asked is internally when Brian's a lawyer and I'm not, so it's different perspectives. And Brian was suggesting, well, the decision has to be made before the preliminary. And my point was that it's meant to be one-stop shopping and not multiple nights or multiple hearings. So it needs to be broken up. Specifically though, those two aspects need to be broken up with their own dedicated findings and decision to go with each other.
I think it would also be helpful for the board in advance to have a list of the, I don't want to say generic findings, but of the relevant findings for the two different aspects of this.
Mm-hmm. The standards.
Yes.
Yeah.
Particularly because you're not used to seeing the zoning board standards.
We've never been able to dictate the size of the footprint of a building in the past.
Yeah, so Madam Chair, we would, if this application were to come to fruition at some point in time, again, this is new to you as a board, we would clearly articulate what your authority was in granting the variance and what criteria you had to evaluate and how you concluded to a decision. So the findings you need to find, the relief you need to grant, and the reasons for granting the relief.
And would this process include any kind of feedback that staff might receive from CRMC.
Again, I think that's all part of the application process.
Okay.
Okay, so I just want to understand, if we're doing this in two separate motions, and our first motion is to approve the division of these two lots into two separate lots.
No.
So I'll try and simplify it from an application
Well,
standpoint.
let me finish my question. So the first question is to divide the two lots. And then the second question is whether or not we would approve the development of the second lot. But now, once we've divided the two lots, do we now have a conforming lot, a 40,000 square foot lot, that then we can't control because we've already chronologically, we've already separated them?
The order is reversed. You would first decide whether you're going to grant the variance for the creation of the undersized lot. That's what you decide first. If you approve that, then you would look at the plan which would create the subdivision and split them apart. So you look at the hardship part that they were looking at first, that undersized lot first, not you. The order in which you said you decide, it's flipped the other way. So you don't have that problem.
I'll add to that. As a planning board, you do not have the authority to grant approvals for a lot that doesn't comply with zoning. So if you had this before you, if you made an approval motion, you'd be approving a lot that wasn't dimensionally satisfying the zoning code. So the only way to get to that conclusion is by granting relief prior to putting your planning board hat on. So really, one motion is with a zoning relief hat, variance hat on. The second motion, you put your planning board subdivision hat on. The variance that you grant can attach conditions to it, which could encumber potentially two lots, because those two lots are subject to the variance.
And Andy, since the planning board is not used to, for all practical purposes, other than in comprehensive permits, sitting as a zoning board, can you explain to a greater degree how the hardship issue is evaluated or should be evaluated?
I can, but I think I'd rather do that when we're there at the hearing. We'll have it in writing, and whoever's here, me or Pete, will be happy to explain it to you.
I'm still back with what Susan asked, and I don't understand when you reversed the order of her questions, you lost me. And what I see is, first you have to have two lots before you talk about developing two lots.
No, you present the eternal question of the chicken and egg. And this is why back in 1992, this question came up. What do we do? Because back in 1991, 99, there were two Superior Court judges faced with this sort of situation. Someone who wanted to divide a lot into two lots, one was undersized. And one went to the planning board first. And the judge said, no, you can't do that. Planning boards can't grant variances. And another one in another town went to the zoning board, and the judge there, a different judge, says, no, you can't do that. Zoning boards can't create subdivisions. So there was this problem in the law. How do we deal with it? And so what was created was a somewhat cumbersome, but the process we've used for the last 30 years was a three-step process. Go to the planning board first, then the zoning for preliminary but conditional on it, then go to the zoning board, then come back to the planning board. Now the General Assembly has changed the law and created this idea of unified relief, that one board can grant both relief. So that's what you are now. You are the zoning board / planning board sitting on it. So that's why you can, in fact, you have to consider one before the other. So the state law is you consider that zoning first. And I think it's because generally, once it's in compliance with zoning, if you vary it, if you grant the variance so that it's in compliance with zoning, then if you think of it, the subdivision is more or less as of right. You have various controls that you place on it, but a lot of the subdivisions, if they conform to all the zoning requirements, you in the end have to grant them. So that's why you consider that discretionary element first on the zoning. Have they met all the standards that they need for the zoning relief before you look to the subdivision?
That makes sense, Robin, for you. To follow it through, though, if it's a two-step motion, so if your first motion, and I'm just going to use an example, the zone requires 40,000 square feet for a lot. The variance, and I'm just using it, not germane to this actual dimensions of this application, but if someone wanted to create 2 lots in an R40 zone, you would need 80,000 square feet. And so if someone doesn't have that, you can't approve it as a planning board unless someone gets permission to vary from the regulation. And the permission they're seeking is to create a variance, ask for a variance to have a 20,000 square foot lot. If you deny the request for a variance to create an undersized lot, your ability to approve it as a planning board is moot, because you cannot create a lot that doesn't conform to zoning. So they need to get that relief to create a lot that doesn't comply with zoning, and that's your kind of your zoning hat that the legislature is asking you to wear now. And although it's one application, it's really 2 steps within the application process and 2 separate motions. The first motion would be a request from the applicant to vary from the zoning code from a dimensional requirement, and you would be acting as a yes or no entity in a semi-judicial, because you're really writing a new zoning code for that lot, a judicial form to approve the variation from the zoning requirements. If you said yes, then you could move forward with a subdivision. 1 lot would be undersized and 1 lot would be conforming. They could ask for 2 undersized lots.
I see that the second step is a moot point if,
Yeah.
and I guess that's why I didn't understand what was wrong with Susan's question. Wasn't that what Susan asked for us, was
No,
can they separate
Susan
the
asked if
lot?
you can do the subdivision first. You have to grant the variance, the relief from zoning first.
And I think having the standards for zoning relief in front of us would make it much more understandable. And this would also help us better understand Andy's comment about why this would not be setting a precedent. Caper?
No, I was simply going to say that I think that a lot of the confusion is because we will be making all of the decisions, we will ultimately be discussing all of the issues and making all of the decisions at a single meeting, and we will have addressed all of our concerns, or we should have by the time we make the decision. So while it's quite true that things come in a set order, theoretically, it's a distinction that I wouldn't get too hung up on, because we will be having all of the discussions in the same time. So it's just a question of logic.
And I think also advice to the applicant, be absolutely as thorough as possible, trying to integrate the questions and concerns that you've heard this evening into your narrative presentation at the appropriate time. Susan?
So legally, and moving forward, because, this isn't going to be the planning board here forever, is having that second lot be an R40 conforming lot, does that change what could be done with that lot in the future, as opposed to, say, creating 2 undersized lots, where one is only 35,000 square feet and the other one is also a little undersized, which would limit future development? Or 5 years from now, are they going to come, nothing about you guys, would a developer come back and say, here, I have a 1 acre lot and I want to do something else with it? like how long and how permanent is any binds we put on a now compliant lot in this neighborhood?
Well, that's an interesting question. And I think that, as I said, because you're handling it as unified development, the same thing that says to me that you can, in fact, regulate the size and location of the house on the new lot, that's going to be part of the zoning decision. The decision that you grant is going to go on the land evidence records for both of these lots, so that it will go forward in time. So that if somebody in 5 or 10 years wants to expand beyond what you allowed, for example, they would have to come back to the board at that time. It's not that they can never do it, but they can't do it without coming back to the board to seek additional relief.
And would the size of that lot then be irrelevant?
Yes,
Okay.
I think so. I mean, you have a very interesting way of doing it, but I don't think it's necessary. My view is, because it's unified relief, it's both here, it's both lots that are affected. So therefore, it's not like they were both totally conforming. So therefore, the conditions can apply to both lots going into the future. Both of them would be properties. The use would be a use by zoning variance. So they would have to come back for that.
Andy, somewhat related to Susan's question, in the past, we have sometimes had applications in which there is a condition that said there will be no further subdivision of this lot. Is that something that is not relevant in this case, or?
I don't know whether it's relevant or not. I'll just say, I mean, you could require that as well. You could impose that condition as well. And again, they could come back in the future to ask for relief for that condition, but they couldn't do it as of right without coming back.
Okay. Any other thoughts? Lots of good questions and comments this evening. Anything, Jay?
When you guys prepare to submit for the preliminary, will the plans be updated? Will the plans, a different plan set be submitted?
I anticipate yes,
Okay.
but I hadn't thought about it until you just raised it.
I was actually going to say, so because, I mean, for the zoning part, it's one thing, but for the subdivision, you're going to need to submit a plan that complies with all the requirements of the checklist for the minor subdivision, and including updating, I guess this is 2013, and I noticed, there's certain things that look like they've been drawn in by hand on this plan. So you'd need to have a formal updated plan for that.
And that's all prescribed in our checklists, for the submission items. The documentation you submitted was fine for pre-app for discussion purposes, but when it comes down to the actual relief, down to the decimal, we're gonna rely on that plan to tell us what that is.
Understood.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So the next step, since this may be a kind of a case of first impression here for many of us, if not all of us, the next step would be, would we have another pre-application addressing the concerns that were raised, questions this evening, or?
No, I think your next step would be to file your application, your combined applications for the zoning relief and for the subdivision as UDR, and it would get scheduled on a regular meeting. And then you'd be sending out notice as well.
Andy, do they have the option to go before TRC if they feel that there are technical issues that need to be further discussed?
I'll just chime in. It automatically would go to TRC. If this presented as a minor subdivision without the relief, TRC would be approving it. But it will be going to TRC and then subsequently to planning.
And after the technical review committee takes a look, will we get that report or that input, or how does it?
Yes, there'll be report and recommendations from the technical review committee. And I mean, you also have the opportunity to be there too, obviously.
Oh, very good, very good.
It will be a day meeting, but it is a public meeting.
Thank you. Anything else? Thank you, Madam Chair, members of the board. Mr. Tights, always good to see you.
Thank you. Our next agenda item under reports and special items is legal discussion on legislative changes to Rhode Island associated with land use. A rather hefty item.
Well, I think I can cut it down to about 4 or 5 hours. No, I mean, the question actually, we've actually had a very good discussion on part of it with the unified development, and raised some questions that I hadn't thought of. Interesting suggestions, like that idea of, maybe the larger lot needs to be smaller or whatnot. So a lot of good questions. And we definitely will be looking towards, and I don't think the General Assembly provides a clear answer, but we're going to at least provide our opinion of the big open question I have in my mind is, can we restrict accessory dwelling units in the future as a condition of zoning relief? And I don't know the answer to that yet, but we will come up with our best guess on that for you. Most of the other stuff is, fairly straightforward. As far as the legislative changes, I mean, there's nothing new. We've been dealing with ADUs, and we've been dealing with the residents. I think you've seen that before. You've seen the memo that we had about the number of unrelated people. Fortunately, I think the town of South Kingstown is in a very good position because you already had the special use permit procedure for people who wanted more than the 5, the 4 that were allowed, and now 5. So I think we got a good process in place. If there's someone who comes in with, wanting more, they have a way to do it. And the fact that we allow it by special use permit also makes it harder for someone to challenge it right from the start. They can't really facially challenge it before a court. They would have to come in and be denied before they could appeal it and challenge it. So we're going to have work to do over the next months, amending the ordinance and the regs again to conform with those changes from early July on the General Assembly. Beyond that, I don't have anything specific. I'm happy to, answer questions or talk about it. I know, Maria, I guess you wanted to talk about the TRC, but it's really up to you to, what questions do you have or want to talk about it? I don't have a prepared agenda on it.
I think one of the things that is going to come up, both in our community and others, is this new designation for minor subdivision in which 9 lots can be approved or shall be approved and reviewed by the administrative officer or officers without any notice to abutting property owners and without any review by the planning board. And I worry that when that becomes public knowledge, there will be a very strong reaction from folks in every community. And I know that one of the suggestions that you have made based on conversations with other communities has been to find a way to assist the administrative officer via input from the TRC with potentially an additional planning board member, so that there is some degree of vetting that will also assist that administrative officer in their review to provide a little assistance and input from sort of the broader view of planning board members.
Well, you have 2 members of the planning board now on the
One.
TRC, right? 1? Oh,
Only
okay.
one.
All right. And you'll be going to 2. I think that's fine. I just, I have to caution you that it's not another bite at the apple. It really has to be kept as a technical review, pointing out issues to the applicant and so forth, and a recommendation to the board, recommendation to the administrative officer, but that's all it is in the
Correct.
end.
But at least to have that advisory opinion that now is to the planning board, then you'd have that similar advisory opinion to the administrative officer. And have there been any conversations with regard to, obviously this is not, these types of projects are not allowed to be noticed to folks in the community.
Right.
Have there been conversations about posting the agenda so that others might be aware that the TRC is happening or anything like that? Because there will be an outcry from the public, as you can well imagine.
Expanding upon Maria's comments, again, with the TRC being advisory and the AO's role, Andy, can you just expand upon or explain the role of the AO, that when the AO is reviewing, we'll call it a 3-lot subdivision, that we are looking for compliance with the regulations, dimensionally, land use, setbacks, area, septic, sightline, driveways. It's not whether or not the neighbors want something out of the developer because a new developer's going, some of that ability to have that discussion is limited in the role of the AO because we have to look at it in a compliant manner. Does the subdivision as applied for comply with the requirements of the zoning regulations? So, a lot of times buffers are discussed. If the buffers aren't in the regulations, TRC can suggest buffers, but if the developer doesn't acquiesce to that and put them on the plans, the AO cannot deny it because the developer refused to put a buffer in. Because that buffer, if it's not required by the regulations, the AO's hands are kind of tied. So again, I'd like Andy to weigh in on that.
And also, Andy,
And we strive for the best style of development within the regulations and push as hard as we can to get that style of development.
well, exactly. Planning, as everyone knows from our conversations at our meetings, is a little more nuanced. It's not just check off the boxes, because if it were, we wouldn't need any of you or any of us. It would just be comply with the computer program and you're approved.
Well, that's certainly the goal of the legislation.
Eliminate human input.
Well, to minimize discretionary input. That is the goal. Because the goal is to speed up production of housing, and which is seen as removing or minimizing regulatory barriers to it. So, I do think you have to be careful of, as I said, you can't just duplicate the process with another name and slow it down. I do think, it is explicit in minor subdivisions. The administrative officer may utilize the technical review committee for initial review and recommendation. And so that's what I was saying. So, I think it's important to realize, even with 2 members of the planning board on it, it's going to be that it's going to be a rare occurrence for a minor subdivision, I think, where the technical review committee is going to be continuing something and saying, come back here with more information or more information. They may have a recommendation that says, provide more recommendation. We think the AO needs more info, provide more. But they're not going to be multiple TRC meetings for any one application except for, a few rare ones. And there may be some where the applicants ask for it. Oh, okay, let's come back here again later. So that's going to be a big change. Other than that, I think, looking at it, making the recommendations to the AO. As far as notice to the public, one of the things that we have talked about in other communities is, well, the easy one is certainly that, all of this stuff gets listed even on planning board agendas as, applications pending AO approval and on the website, so that people see that, at least they can see that. There really has to be, some effort for people to do it. Obviously, also try to, encourage people to sign up for the agenda from the TRC and the planning board, which is, relatively easy to do with the Secretary of State's. And actually, we've got several slides that Nancy Hess put together, which is a nice step-by-step goal for someone who's not computer literate, to take them through the steps of that. And, I think we could provide that. Beyond that, the other question, and I hesitate to recommend it because it's a lot more work for staff. But one thought is that you provide notice to people within a radius. The town has to do it, can't make the applicant do it. The town provides a notice to people. Any item that's going to be on the TRC, they provide notice to people within a 200-foot radius of it. And my suggestion was there too, that it's not even a specific notice of your thing. It's, here's a copy of the TRC agenda that you're getting because you happen to be in there. But, that is going, it's a lot easier to do with GIS now and automation, but it's still going to be a lot of work to come up with that, for particularly as you're sending more stuff to the TRC to do it. My suggestion is not to do it at first. Let's keep that as a back pocket thing if we need to do it, if things aren't working, if there is a huge upcry and there has to be something done. I wouldn't go with it up front, because I just see it. It also is creating a misleading thing. People get the notice, then they think, oh, well, I can go and be heard here, and I'm not going to. So, it's got to say that these are not public hearings. People do not have a right to speak at them. So, to some extent, you're going to be annoying people for no reason. So my advice is not to do it, not to do that. You asked me what other things are other towns are considering. My advice is not to do it, at least initially. Just do it with the public outreach of, here are the applications that will be considered. We urge you sign up for the emails about these notices, and people will have to take a little bit of effort when they get here's a copy of the upcoming agenda, look at the planning board agenda, look at, not so much the planning board agenda, because if it's at the planning board, it's probably something that they'd get notice of anyway. But particularly the TRC agenda, just look down it, see, is this something near me that I care about?
Okay, thanks. And back to compliance with, looking at a project that might meet the setbacks, but we have very often had an applicant that may not look at things with regard to the best possible site planning, more of a two-dimensional view, and often planning staff will say, well, gee, if you change the location of the house and the driveway, then it would be better accessed, or it would be less impactful, you would save money, or, many of those things might come up based on a good assessment by a planner. So, that's why I think having that ability to say, well, yes, it's zoned properly and you have X amount of houses, but you might want to make this adjustment for X, Y, and Z reasons.
Well, and you have one of the best planning staffs in the state, as well as one of the larger planning staffs for a town your size. So I think you have to let them do their job. And I think, they're very likely to probably do that anyway. And the people who don't listen to them now will continue to not listen to them. And the people who will listen, if it's a staff rather than the planning board. I think, that's going to happen as best it can happen anyway, and there will be a little bit of a backstop with the TRC. But I think you just have to go that forward. And I think you have to realize, there will probably be some people, as there are now, who say, I don't care if it'd be better, this is what I want. And if they're legally entitled to it, then we have to allow it.
I think Andy did a good summary of that. I may use that again, but again, we will do our best to get the highest quality development for everything that's reviewed by our office. And we have those who are willing to seek guidance and advice, and there are other applicants who are less willing to seek guidance and advice. The difficulty is there will always be someone looking over the shoulder of why certain things got approved, and you've heard me use the term before that some things are viewed as not necessarily a SK appropriate end product, but they're regulatory compliant. I want everyone to understand we will do our best, but the Rhode Island legislature tied one, if not both of our hands behind our back, because we have to review it for compliance against the regulation. And sometimes compliance against the regulation means approval of something that may not be viewed as a certain standard that people are accustomed to. But our zoning code requires us to approve an application that is compliant. So, but again, we will do our best to influence and get a good product from all applicants.
And before, I'm going to be very quick with this. With all the changes that have been going on, our zoning ordinance and our subregs are in dire need of updating. With that on our minds, going forward, if there are things that the planning board had routinely considered as part of their review and approval of things that are no longer going to be in your purview any longer, consider maybe making that regulatory. If it was always a vegetative buffer up against a parking lot for headlights, let's say, then make it a regulation in our ordinance that is required. That way, it gives a checkbox for the AO to say, yep, it's all there.
Your comment is perfectly timed to something I was going to bring up at our next agenda item,
You
but...
just cut me off at the knees.
Right.
Well, no, that's exactly.
Go
That was
ahead.
exactly what I wanted to talk about, was that all that I heard you guys say tonight was democracy dies in the darkness. When people find out that we collectively are going to approve an 8-unit subdivision, and we're deliberately not letting them speak, and we're not even going to tell them about it because they're not even going to get to have anything to say about it, we come out smelling like we're doing something behind closed doors, even though it's not our fault. But it's so bad, and no one in this town knows about it until we're going to get a big development, and people are going to be told, you're not even allowed to comment on it, we don't want to hear from you, because you have no right to speak. It makes us look like something nefarious is going on in the town. Like, that's how it's going to look. And if Jamie or you or whoever the AO is has no teeth to even say we're saving some stone walls and please don't cut down that 100-year-old oak tree, then we even look stupider. So I agree that we need to have some regulations bumped up, some ordinances now before anything comes. But also, I do think there needs to be some policy in place where it doesn't look like we are rubber stamping development and not letting people speak. Like, that just is our town is pretty engaged. This is going to go down really bad. We're going to look like we're up to something. I'm sorry, that's just how it's going to look when we're rubber stamping things and telling people they're not allowed to speak. And it's not us, but that's the way it's going to look for us.
And to that effect, and also to Jay's excellent comments about the regulations, dire need. Many people think that landscaping regulations are just the proverbial parsley around the pig, and they serve as mitigation for stormwater. They serve as areas for neighborhood gatherings, children play areas for children. They serve to buffer impacts of street traffic, buffers from one neighbor to the other. And I think it's been more than 5 years now, advocating for, with my background in horticulture, to redo the landscaping regulations, which have not been looked at in, I think originally they were written in the 70s, and perhaps they were updated a little bit in the 90s. The diagrams are poor. The regulations don't give you enough choices, and they certainly don't work with infill projects like we have seen recently, where the only option is to ask for a waiver of zero landscaping. And it's those infill projects that more than anything need something that can fit, some kind of flexibility. And they're also located in different parts of our ordinances. They're unclear, certainly to applicants. We have had a landscape architect who is from South Kingstown, who has been a landscape architect for many years in a major engineering firm, who has volunteered to help write those landscape regulations. And so that it would be less of a burden on staff, I would certainly recommend taking him up on the offer now before it expires, even if we had to do it via a subcommittee of the planning board or some means so that we could get it done without any excess burden on staff. And I feel very strongly about this, and I would like to have the support of the board on this to direct staff that this is what we would like to see happen, because it's going to be even more important now moving forward.
Well, I mean, you certainly have my support. You know, a lot of times when we have an applicant and they meet the regulation, we still try to push for, even though we may not be able to require it, we still try to push for mitigating whatever impacts are to the neighbors. And usually we're pretty successful at that. And a lot of times that is actually vegetation. So sometimes vegetation is not even called out in our regulations, but there's an impact to the neighbor, whether it's the way that the car pulls in or the way that the backyards, you know. So I think given that, I think not only what Maria said, but I think we might want to expand it to try to understand what are those impacts and how can we change it maybe above and beyond what we currently have to, you know, address those impacts.
Anyone else?
So I have one little question. So we saw a commercial development in the last year where they had proposed this like rip-rap stormwater thing, and we talked them into some rain gardens and some native plantings. I'm assuming we actually had no right to even ask that. But they complied, and it's going to be a much nicer project because of that tweak to their project. With this new legislation, would you not even be in a position to ask for a rain garden versus our ordinance, which says rip-rap stormwater management is fine? Like, you know, I'm saying, like, is this also even take away the discretion that Joe just talked about, where, you know, we just had a project tonight where we're hoping that there's a buffer to the neighbors. But if it ain't written down, we're not even really allowed to ask for it. But they'll probably give it to us because they want us to like them. Would you then be in a position to ask, and I realize there was a variance on this that made it a little different, but how does this change asking for favors from?
It needs to be in the ordinance.
I think to try and answer your question to the best of your ability, we work in a regulatory framework, and we can we can only deny an application for non-compliance with our regulations. So there are always a host of things that we will see that could make a development better, that we will insightfully have the conversations with the applicant of, have you thought of this versus that? It's the same dollar, it's just spent differently, and it may have a positive impact on the neighborhood versus what you were, I don't want to say it's a positive impact, but a more favorable impact on the neighborhood than what you were proposing. But to council's point earlier, there are some applicants who just say no, or Jay and I have the conversation on occasion where the attorney says, can you please show me which section of the regulations my client is required to do that under? And if we do not have that section, they're simply not required to do it. And if the neighbors or the planning board is opposed to that position, please understand that the AO cannot deny something because there's a better option. There has to be a regulatory requirement to make them pick that better option. And to Leah's point, these are the things on our plate right now. And if I can just go through them really.
Before you do
Yeah.
that, you just made the case for us changing the regulations so that you can say the applicant can fulfill this requirement by doing X, Y, or Z. We are lacking those things right now. We need to add them. I don't think it would be terribly complicated. Good drawings. Again, we have a volunteer, an experienced landscape architect, 30 years, went to URI. I think we need to do this now because we'll be happy we have that flexibility when the AO or the board as a whole is looking at a project.
Yeah,
So I'm afraid we're going to have this long list of why we can't do it.
No, I'm not saying why we
I don't want to
can't
hear
do
that
it.
anymore.
What I'm leading to is I think the landscaping potentially is a two-step process, that there's probably on the landscaping code, there's some quick things that can be done quickly. And then there's a much broader look. And again, that's a conversation with Randy Collins of what are those quick things that can be done in the next 3 months or so, 3 to 6 months, and then is it a much heavier lift to do a broader overview and an overhaul of the landscape regulation? We know those common things we're facing every day. It's a caliper of trees, it's the number of trees, it's the understory canopy, it's the drawings associated with that, it's buffering on certain types of developments. That, to me, those are quick changes that can be made, and I don't want to get bogged down on we'll just use the term, there's a 5-page version and there's a 20-page version. Let's do the 5-page version as quick as we can as we work on the 20-page version.
On the landscape requirement, sometimes we have people come in front of us and ask for relief, say they can't meet the landscapes. Can we make it a requirement that in order for them to get relief from landscape requirements, that they have to provide from a registered landscape architect best achievable alternative? So if they say I can't do that, then the question is, what can you do? Maybe you can't put shrubbery here because it's paved and they need to use that as access, but what's your best achievable alternative? Because I got to believe there's not going to be too many landscape architects just come into us and say, I'm sorry, I can't do anything. They're going to try to find something.
Leave it paved. They're not going to say that.
Can we make that a requirement?
Creativity and flexibility.
Anything that requires, and again, Andy can correct me, anything that requires waiver relief can't be granted by the administrative officer.
No, I'm asking things that come in front of us.
Yeah. Well, again, you could simply, and I want to say that's what the planning board and planning staff have become very skilled at, is you now need relief from a landscape code. What are your alternatives? To us, there is never code or nothing. There's always, to your point, Joe, there is an alternative. Provide the alternative. I think my concern over that is you're always going to get the request for relief in an alternative.
But it's really good
You're
language.
pointing out that you don't have.
Sometimes sometimes we get people to come in here and they say, we're asking for relief because we just can't do it. I'm not sure that they've gone the next step to get a landscape architect to say, what can I do? What's the very best that we can do? And then we're saying, can you put some shrubbery over here? How about if you change the driveway that way? How about and we're trying to do it on the fly there versus them seeing a professional and coming to us and saying, this is the best I can do.
That's the advantage of having a landscape architect help us with language in our regulations to provide that type of diverse, happy medium that we might encounter. So it will be stated in the regulations, instead of just, okay, it's got to be a 30-foot full screen versus a, 10-foot partial screen or whatever. It's got more suggestions that lead to more alternatives, given the site. It doesn't mean that they automatically get a pass, depending on the size and scale of a project, but they have to do something. And that's what we're lacking. And there are several basic things that are lacking that should be able to be done, at least in that initial first step.
Isn't that an excellent proposed amendment to when you're updating the forms? Because if the forms say what are the submissions that are required.
Well, and this goes back to Andy's point earlier. The conversation is had with every applicant. If you're asking for a waiver, what is the alternative? 75% of your applicants propose alternatives. 25% say we're asking for a waiver. Why do you need a waiver? Because in order to fit my development that I want, that works with my Excel spreadsheet, I don't need to do landscaping, or I have to remove a unit.
So you're basically saying that's an addition to the form that would make no difference because
We have applicants who seek guidance and have good conversations, but I'm not saying it's potentially not a good idea to add language in there that says if you are seeking a waiver, what is your alternative proposal? And then they would have to put in writing, none, versus something.
The landscape architect who's volunteered to help us with this project has worked in multiple communities and faces this kind of thing on a regular basis. And it may also be helpful to have an expansion of language or questions within the checklist that then point to the revised regulations that could be helpful. I don't know, Jay's the only one who has the checklist memorized, so.
So again, I think there's some consensus that we'll reach out to our fellow resident to look at some sort of timetable and his availability to assist in working on our landscape regulations.
And I'm sure that we would probably, if we needed to establish a subcommittee, we would have enough volunteers from the board who would like to participate in that.
I'll volunteer.
Great, thank you.
All right.
And Jamie, when you go through that list, can you also be specific as to what things the planning board is not involved with? Because
Okay.
there are a lot of
Yeah.
things on there that are not familiar to us.
So again, this is kind of just a workload within the department and things we are working on, so you understand some of the projects that you see regularly and that you may hear about but not be extremely familiar about. Old Tower Hill Road and the redevelopment capabilities of that neighborhood, Able City East, formerly Dover and Cole, and SK staff have been working on that. We're in the process of receiving a draft report from the results of the May and June work from Jason King and his wife, as well as the economic consultant. So that should be coming in the near term, in the next week or so. The facade program is associated with the American Rescue funds targeted for Wakefield and Peacedale. We have $1.25 million. We had a date for submission of August 30th for asking for grant money. The town manager officer has modified that with a hard date of August 30th, but we are accepting rolling applications. We have 4 applications right now that we're trying to put the team together who's on the review committee to evaluate those and make a recommendation to town council for funding. So there are, and we anticipate another 6 to 10 applications to come in by the end of the month. The Route 1 stewardship study plan that's being worked on by Randy Collins and the Beta Group. Jay is a staff liaison for that committee, and that is being actively worked on. And I believe, Jay, just today or yesterday, you sent an email out with that draft plan? Today.
Yes, on the 8th, by the way, Jay. Yes, on the 8th. I didn't respond to your email.
So, we also did an RFQ and have signed a contract with Union Studios for an affordable housing initiative associated with town-owned property, namely the Watson property, which is in West Kingston, the Wakefield Elementary School, and South Road School. We're expecting to get some conceptual drawings from them within the next 3 weeks, I believe, and then we are scheduled to have meetings in those communities, South Road School, Wakefield, and then either at Union Fire District's property or the church's property in West Kingston to discuss the Watson piece.
And Jamie, the board, you'll notify the board of those opportunities,
Yes. Yeah.
because we've been a little bit out of the loop with that.
We
We
have-
know it's
again,
ongoing, but we haven't
We're
been.
just working on the PR brochures to go out and the news flashes to go out on those. We're just trying to solidify the meeting place for the Watson property.
Is the fourth location not available?
The fourth location is off the table. So it is not on the market for us to acquire. The next one is a hazardous mitigation study plan. There's a requirement for the town to have a hazard mitigation plan. It needs to be updated every 5 years. We received a $45,000 grant on a $50,000 study. The town is doing $5,000 in kind, and the consultant is actually doing the other $45,000 worth of work. That's the Beta Group. We have a subcommittee being established for that, and we should be initiating that in the next 2 to 3 weeks. It's been tough getting the consultant and our subcommittee together. The EMS project is associated with the town's new emergency management service facility building proposed for Ministerial Road between the old Route 1A and Route 1. We're in final design phases for that layout. We've already received permits from DEM for on-site septic. We're working on our PAP, which is the curb cut permitting. That also has to go to Scenic Highways for the state, but that should go out for bid, we're hoping in September, with a contractor selection available for town council to make a decision in December. So that is a roughly 3,600 square foot facility. It will house 2 emergency response vehicles with a price tag hovering around $2 million. We received a $1 million earmark from Congress, as well as an appropriation of $1 million of the town's American Rescue Plan Act funds. So,
Can I ask you something before we move on? Is the other EMS project, which is the
on
deep,
Matunic Beach Road,
well, there's that,
Matunic Schoolhouse Road.
okay, well, there's that question, but then there's also the property that's next to the hospital. Is that also something that,
That's separate and just separate from this project.
so this EMS is just the one on Ministerial Road?
Yes,
Okay.
that's probably one I left off my list that we're still involved in, but that's on and off involvement. So that is moving forward slowly. The hospital project. So just to back up, Susan asked a question. The town entered an agreement with the hospital to potentially sell the existing public service building to the hospital. Part of that sale is a requirement that the hospital build a 2-bay EMS facility with both the bay space for the vehicles and the staff space to man those vehicles, including overnight accommodations. So
Is that something that we'll ever see?
I will get clarification on that. So,
So since we're now EMS, the Matunic Fire Station, I thought when we saw that project, it was a different project that might or might not include a separate building out the back.
correct.
And I thought that that whole thing moved. And then I drove by and saw a new fire station.
So the fire station remained an active project. The EMS building on the rear of that property, that infrastructure moved to Ministerial Road.
So did we approve that fire station rebuild at that
Correct.
time?
Yes.
Oh,
With the option to either include or not include the EMS building in the rear of the property.
thank you for refreshing my memory.
Sure.
The fire department used to, not the fire department, excuse me, the hospital provided, for lack of a better title, like a 5-year master plan on what their thoughts were, how they potentially would, change the site around, et cetera, et cetera. Is that something that, it's probably coming due, and two, it would be interesting, it's obviously early if they just bought it, but it would be good to have an understanding.
Yeah. The 5-year master plan does not contemplate the parking expansion and the redo of the EMS building that is under consideration now. So potentially you would see an amendment to a previously approved master plan to include a reconfiguration of parking and EMS building, egress to and from Route 1, as well as if that project
Whatever
moves
else they're
forward.
doing with that land, right? That's a
Yes.
pretty good, yeah.
Yes. But again, those things are still being discussed and worked out. A couple of things that you may not be aware of is Brian Wagner and the Historic Commission was able to secure a $10,000 grant for his Matunic, I'm calling it the Matunic Climate Change Study. So they received a grant to evaluate what sea level rise and climate change may potentially impact as it relates to historic properties in the Matunic area, Matunic Beach area. So that's actively being done now.
This is really good to hear. Just wondering how this will go beyond the storm tools that already exist from URI's GSO. And was this restricted to a particular area for a reason? Because that's,
Again, the funds were
Ground zero,
limited
essentially.
and the grant application was targeted for, we'll say, Matunic Beach area proper, oceanfront.
because it says historic, so that is a little confusing.
Yeah. So again, it's looking at what are deemed historic structures and properties within the Matunic Village area. So
Wouldn't include the shipping containers.
they stay there long enough, they'll be considered historic. So, the senior center parking lot reconfiguration, that's on Broad Rock. We're looking at making improvements to both the amount of parking and the access in and out of that building as it relates to ADA. That building is heavily used. There's a large ADA component. There's minimal ADA parking, so we're looking at a reconfiguration of that. We just released an RFQ for consulting services on that. So planning and DPS have been working hand in hand with the town manager's office, as well as senior services and the rec department, because they have holdings both north and east of there.
Yeah, I would have thought that that would have been in their bailiwick so that planning staff would have a little bit of a break.
Well, again, we want to make sure that that parking lot respects the zoning code as it relates to landscaping and islands and configuration versus
There we go with
all
the
asphalt.
nuance, right?
All asphalt. So.
There you go.
Wakefield Library, interesting project. We received grant funds, and the library was very instrumental at receiving those funds. I think we're pushing close to $1 million now, where they're going to do some interior renovations, and we received additional grant funding to look at parking lot reconfiguration, which will also allow us to look at garden and park upgrades If people may not even realize that as you enter the access to the parking lot and Peacedale, there is a public park to the right of that with walking paths that have been planted and maintained over time. The standard of maintenance may potentially be lax in the last few years just because of the nature of funding and accessibility. So they're going to look at that in that redo process.
You mean Peacedale Library, right?
Peacedale Library.
Yeah.
Sorry, yes.
So I've heard a rumor that the town is talking about taking a portion of that Hazard Memorial Park away and turning it into a parking lot. Is that an idle rumor, or is that part of their proposal?
There are a number of concept plans that have been floating around, but no final layout has been solidified.
That's pretty non-committal.
There is no definitive plan at this point in time for a parking lot layout.
But there is a proposed plan that would have a portion of that park become a parking lot? That's one of the plans on the table?
Well, again, part of that is developing more visibility and access and parking both for the library and the park. If you want the library to be successful and you want the park to be successful, an evaluation of how that can be accomplished is being undertaken. Again, I would say 50% of the population drives into that library and doesn't realize there's a park to the right of that. Yeah. Or where is the entrance to that park? It's not clearly identified.
True.
Yeah. So,
And there are grade changes associated with that site as well.
so again, planning is working their best to balance the needs of the community as well as the users of the library. So that may sound non-committal, but I'm not aware of any final decisions that have been made.
It wasn't non-committal in that I can understand your thought bubble. But I'm also looking at Kingston Library, which owns 2 parking spaces. The town is not committed to locating more parking for that library. So pretty much everyone in town who needs to go to the library now needs to go to Peacedale because there's no parking in Kingston. So, sorry, it feels to me like a self-created problem that if we don't expand or propose parking in Kingston, we're making it harder for Peacedale Library to assist on the parking it has. And now taking a park in Peacedale to create parking for the library that could share the load with Kingston if effort was made for parking at Kingston. That's my commentary on that.
Point taken.
What's the schedule on that? Time frame?
Yeah, construction drawings are being done, project manager's been assigned. I think winter, spring construction. Again, with money, that one is very stringent. I think if the money's not spent by a specific date, you lose all those funds. So that's on a tight time frame. Again, the ARPA 5 Village Studies final review of work product from Weston and Sampson is in the Deputy Town Manager's office. Update to Wakefield and Peacedale.
Jamie, just a quick question on that. That seemed to go on forever with no kind of conclusion, and I think it was just...
We have 5 village studies with recommendations that are contained within those documents.
So it's up to the council to pick and choose.
And again, they're moving forward with improvements to both Wakefield and Peacedale and the facade program. That's moving forward. On an update to Wakefield and Peacedale streetscapes, we did receive an additional $350,000 of state funding and a grant application that our department put together. And we are matching that with, I believe, we have to adjust our match. Because they asked for $500,000 with $1 million match, and we only received $350,000, so we're going to reduce our match proportionally with that.
That's really good to hear, because I knew that there was streetscape money out there, but didn't know if we had the capacity to apply for it. So very encouraging to hear that.
I did, yeah, on Thursday evening for a Friday afternoon deadline. So, I'm like, we need to do something. We did it, and we actually got the grant. So, again, town manager's office, Luke Murray's a landscape architect by training. We're looking at updating some of the hardscape benches, lighting, planters, streetscape, as it relates to street trees and other items. Legislative changes, we've touched upon those a little, and I just want to give kudos to Mr. Parker sitting to my left. He's been working very diligently on updating an online permitting system, which is a heavy lift near term, but should help expedite our workflow as time moves forward, where all applications will be coming in digitally and handled and processed. And distributed internally too, because there's a lot of moving pieces to Mark Comboy's office and their review that can take place electronically once this system is up and running. I don't know, Jay, if you want anything to add to that.
While I have most of the bones of it put together, it's going to be a work in progress to see how we fine tune it to make it work, and we won't know until we actually start employing it and seeing how it works.
And then we touched upon this a little bit, general review and modern update of our regulations. You know, you've heard Brian say it, Jay say it, and myself say it, and council probably mutters it at some point in times, that our regulations are interwoven in a unique manner between zoning and subdivision and development standards, and we need to tackle that at some point in time. It's in our capital budget to do that in 2025, 2026, but depending on workload, we may try and move portions of that forward, depending on staff timing and potential consultant assistance.
I was going to say, is this something you can farm out?
Again, as we go through the Old Tower Hill project, we're going to get some sample regulations from them, and we'll see how that can potentially let us plug and play in other avenues of our regulations. But when you put everything together, you have a 200-plus page code between subdivision and zoning regulations, so it's not a minor task.
Yes, and we're also hoping that what is it called, Able City East now, will incorporate their the potential zoning language changes to that area that would also create usable language for both the prior projects of Missing Middle and Cottage.
And again, the language we work with Able City on could be the model of how we structure the remaining items in our regulations. So, prior projects, we have the Missing Middle with Union Studios in Horsley Witten. We have concluded that, but there's always a question from the Affordable Housing Collaborative on where is the missing middle regulatory change. What is the status of that? Is the planning board ever going to tackle mansion house, townhouse, threeplex, fourplex in any of the zones? I think there was some direction, or that was on the side for the time being until we get through the Old Tower Hill Road study. But again, that keeps coming up, and Joe, if I'm missing anything, but it's a continued item of discussion at the Affordable Housing Collaborative.
And we had hoped that this consultant would be able to give us language that we could use to do that, because they're looking at it from both the zoning regulatory language and the physical architectural mass and scale and design standard, which
Tho-
is very helpful to have
Yeah.
both of those.
Remember, so the range of housing goes from single family to large apartment. They're going to be looking at the kind of right-hand side of that. They're going to be looking at the stack flats, multi-story rental apartment type structures. They're not geared towards developing mansion home regulations for a commercial corridor.
No, but the residential component of that, within that commercial corridor, things like fourplexes and different types and scale of residential development was part of their thought
Yes.
process.
Yeah.
So that's
But-
why I think we should use that.
You know, I know you know this, existing regulations have single-family and duplexes, and then from there it goes up to development plan review for a 12-unit. Because it goes up to a 12-unit, the regulations and the concerns are based on a 12-unit. So it requires water, it requires sewers. There's a big gap for 3 families, 4 families, 5 families, 6 families that doesn't necessarily need that level of infrastructure. That we're missing that in this town, and I think it's a regulatory change that we look at. It's where can 6 families fit in, and I think it's 4 families. They could probably fit into other areas of the town than what's required for a 12-unit. The Women's Development Corp., when they gave testimony, they talked about building their affordable housing up to 30 or 40 units using OWTS. And yet we require, if it's more than a 2-family, you have to be on city sewer. So we're missing opportunities and make it difficult for affordable housing in this town.
And so our missing middle is not necessarily limited to a financial middle, but that middle between 2 and 12.
From my perspective,
Right.
the missing
Right.
middle is missing from South Kingstown regulations.
Right, and but it's not just the financial,
It's not just the financial.
which I think is misunderstood.
It's what the zoning requirements are, it's what our requirements for infrastructure is.
And I was under the impression that now Able City East would be looking at a range because it is a fairly large corridor. And going back to the URI student project, they showed a range of housing types within that corridor.
They will have
just
a range
what-
of appropriately scaled buildings, again, to the right side of that scale. So mansion house and above.
Explain right side in terms of numbers.
So if you look at, I could pull the chart up, but you
No,
go
just-
single family, duplex, mansion house, triplex, townhouse
Okay, so
setting.
that would fit in
And then
that
you start to
2
go
to
to
12.
stack flats where you'll have 8 units, 12 units, 40 units,
So that's
6 units, 2 stories,
thought.
3 stories, multiple buildings on a lot. They're more in the townhouse stack flats and above, where Joe's talking potentially about 4 units in a
6, 8.
building in an R80 zone, or 4 units in a building in an R40 zone or an R20 zone. You know, that, I think that's a different discussion than what Old Tower Hill Road is. So I'm just bringing it up. Next item there is cottage regulations. I just want to remind you, we're probably a year into the 2-year sunset provision, so I just don't want to lose sight of that. And again, that was prepared by Union Studios, Horsley Witten, and planning staff. And then
Jamie, just to go back to that for a second, since we are sort of at the halfway mark, we don't have any current contract with Union Studio with regard to cottage, correct?
no, that was completed.
Right. It just seems as though it would be helpful if we were able to have some kind of meeting, a working kind of input meeting with the development community, and be able to better understand what the barriers, other than the obvious, it's easier and probably more financially viable for them to build 2 or 3 gigantic houses rather than a cottage development. But we never had that kind of interaction with the development community, and I think often it's
I think-
helpful to educate and listen.
We can look at a little bit further out, potentially having a meeting like that, but again, our feedback internally from the development community is a 3-lot subdivision has certainty. A cottage regulation, they're concerned that even if they meet the regulations, that they're concerned that the planning board will not look favorably on their infill application because of neighborhood pushback. That's what the development community discussions are internal to
Yeah,
our
but it's
office.
only because we don't have one that's actually happened that serves as a good role model for doing similar type.
Right. And we try to
which is what
explain
we
them
need.
that the planning board developed the regulations. If you bring forward a compliant plan under cottage regulations, that the planning board should view it as a favorable application. And if it's code compliant, staff will recommend approval. If it's not code compliant, it's difficult for staff to recommend approval when you don't comply with the regulations. I think one favorable outcome of the cottage regulations is our ability to have a conversation with some of the other developers with regards to impacting their layout to be more like the cottage regulations. So,
Yeah.
are there any questions for Jay or I or Andy on the list we've gone over?
Just to finish up, could you talk about the new lending library we have?
Oh, thank you. Sorry, Maria. That should be on my list. So we being the department, requested funding over the last couple of years to start to establish a planning library, kind of a modern planning library with some of the premier books associated with planning. So we were able to acquire, I want to say 15 or 16 books from various authors, ranging from transportation to cottage tile development, missing middle books. So you've seen the diagrams on missing middle book. We now have the missing middle book in our library. So we'll get a list together of the books and titles and the authors, and we will do that just like a library. We'll loan them out, and you'll sign them out. We won't charge a deposit or a late fee, but we would expect you to be respectful of a 2 or 3 week time frame to look at them and return them, and then we'll move forward.
And is it possible, if we are interested in additional publications, is it something that the library could get? I'm thinking about...
I had, I think, $750 or $800 in last year's budget. I have an additional $750 or $800 in this year's budget. So if there's something as a planning board member you would like to acquire and add to that library, we can evaluate. Again, Ian McCart's Designing with Nature, I didn't add that. I was
That's
trying to
on my
get that
list, yeah.
in a good use condition. We tried to be cost effective. Some of the books are new and some were library stock that we purchased from a library. So
Yes, and
they
that
sat on
one, the
their shelf.
Design with Nature has an update, and just thinking about some of the, if you go onto the National American Planning Association website, they have like the top 100 books by decade on planning, and things like Rural by Design, Small is Beautiful, Geography of Nowhere, those kind of things are really helpful.
And some of the books, I was at the Congress of New Urbanism in May, time flies, in Cincinnati, and they had some of the books, and what was nice is I actually got to flip through some of them, and after flipping through and reading some of the abstracts from them, the decisions were made not to purchase those books because they were very academic in nature, and if I'm struggling to determine the utilization of the book that I'm reading, I moved on from that one. So, And again, 200-page books with no pictures are sometimes.
Right, exactly.
If you came to the library and looked at the one with 200 pages and 100 pictures, you're probably picking that one versus the 200 pages with no pictures.
And we've already got that in our packets, so, you know.
So we will put that list
Thank
together.
you, Jamie. Anything else from anyone? Would someone like to make a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Motion from Joe, is there a second?
I'll second.
Second from Susan. Any further discussion? Hearing none, all those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries.